I know it has been the habit of young people to speak of me and think of me as having always been an old man. Certainly, since I began to talk to my young friends, I have got considerably older than I was when I first introduced myself to them. But I have been a boy like themselves for all that, and I still appreciate and sympathise with all the delights and sorrows of boyhood and girlhood, with an exception, however. I do not appreciate and sympathise with delights or sorrows which have cruelty, falsehood, or indeed any vice as their cause or consequence. Some follies also I am fain to overlook, but folly which endangers life or places people in peril which would not otherwise approach them, or folly which believes not in the sufferings of others, I am very severe upon. Practical joking, a very common and often a very fatal folly, is my special abhorrence. As a boy I was not clever, nor more book-learned, nor more perfect than my contemporaries, nor than my present reader perhaps, but I kept myself clear, either by inclination or by force of advice, from certain follies which I now undertake to reprehend. I hope I have been just during these many years, for I have never rebuked boys for faults which I was partial to in my early youth. All this is vastly dry, you'll say, and more like Peter Prosy than Peter Parley, but I never begin a story wherein I have been myself concerned without telling my young friends that I don't profess to have been the perfection of boyhood, but that I vividly remember my youth, and am, as far as kindliness to youth is concerned, in thorough sympathy with its pleasures and pains, a boy in heart still. Now, having said my prefatory say, I will go on to relate a little adventure which befell me well, never mind how many years ago. Near the village where I was born there used to stand the remains of an old Gothic abbey, formerly dedicated, I believe, to some saint by name Olaus. In medieval times this name was all very well, but as the centuries crept on, so fell away the appellation, as the stones of the abbey themselves, and St. Olaus Abbey was speedily corrupted into St. Owl's, and finally into Owl's Abbey. Perhaps the advanced state of decay in which this old ruin was in my day had helped to favour this title, for Owl's Abbey deserved its name on account of the thousands of night birds which infested and built in it. At the time of which I write, some respectable vestiges still remained of the old pile, a broken arch, a crumbling window, and so on, and I will take this opportunity of instructing my young friends in some of the points whereby they will in future be able to distinguish Gothic from Norman ruins. I often hear youths, otherwise well informed, commit sad blunders in their wild guesses at the different styles of architecture, so I will briefly tell them how to avoid such exposures of ignorance for the rest of their lives. Gothic architecture is often called, and very properly, pointed architecture. This one name will help serve as a guide, for by the term Gothic we understand that style wherein the pointed arch, as applied to various purposes of construction, becomes a leading characteristic of the edifice. This sort of pointed architecture dates from the rise of Christianity itself, and was probably devised in opposition to the pagan form of building. Some say that an avenue of overbranching trees was the object which suggested the Gothic arch, but though authorities are not agreed upon its origin, it is sufficient to remember that Gothic architecture is pointed, while Norman architecture has round arches. The splendid aisles of Westminster Abbey are almost unequalled as specimens of pointed arches, and you will know now that they are Gothic. Specimens of Norman arches you will find in Waltham Abbey, and nearer home at St. Bartholomew's Church, West Smithfield, and these are in contradistinction round. There are many subdivisions of both Gothic and Norman, of course, but I have merely laid down the broad lines by which you will be able to decide on the architecture of this sort of ruin whenever you meet with it, in your rambles or at picnics. Owl's Abbey, then, was an old Gothic ruin, standing at the foot of a pleasant green hill, and embosomed in fine trees. It was a picturesque spot, and used to attract many visitors, pedestrian tourists, and even our own village folk, who would frequently take an alfresco dinner within the old grey walls, while summer-time and daylight lasted. While there was bright sun to light up the dark ivy and keep the bats and owls in their hiding places, such picnics were not rare. Nutting parties would often wander amidst the ruins, and adventurous seekers of nests and trappers of rats and rabbits penetrated the dim recesses of Owl's Abbey at just periods of the year. But when winter stripped the fading trees, and beneath the cold winter's moon the ruins looked ghastly white and skeleton-like in their leaflessness, there was no villager hardy enough to venture even at sunset into the dismal abbey, and as to passing through it by night, though the short-cut to many places lay thereby, that was out of the question. And why do you suppose? Because the simple villagers would have it that the abbey was haunted. Superstition is almost invariably the result of the want of an education, or in plain English, the ignorant are almost always credulous. You will readily understand this by referring to many wonderful appliances of this day, such as gas, steam, electricity as applied to telegraphs, and so on, which, if discovered only 100 years ago, would certainly have brought their inventors to the stake as sorcerers. Yet the world, better informed in these times, regards such men as benefactors to their country and to the world. The old belief in ghosts, goblins, sprites and elves has helped to produce some very pretty poetry, but beyond this I cannot possibly see what gain there could be out of such folly. In these days when science shows us what ghosts and apparitions really are, namely creations of a disordered body or disordered mind, we seldom come across a haunted house in cities. In villages, however, where education grows but slowly, you will generally find some spot supposed to be frequented by spirits, and discover among the less informed folk a tendency to accept any foolish tale of hobgoblins as serious truth. I don't believe that any of my readers are so silly as to feel alarm at passing through dim and silent places by night. They have advantages now which make my belief in their good sense quite secure. The foolish people of the village round and about Owl's Abbey were firmly persuaded that the old ruin was haunted by not only the traditional old abbot who had been barbarously slain at the sacking of the abbey by Oliver Cromwell, but by a more modern apparition, reported to be the wraith of an unfortunate Irish pedlar who had been waylaid, robbed and beaten to death by some desperadoes for the sake of his few brooches, etc. This renowned spectre was called Barneys Ghost, and there were not a few who could declare that they had seen this ghost apparently hunting among the underwood of the abbey for the contents of his pack. Wonders did not cease here, for even the little white stone bridge which spanned the village stream hard by the valley wherein the abbey stood had its mysterious visitor in the impalpable person of a white lady who sat on the keystone of the arch, engaged in the doleful but tidy duty of combing her long golden hair, for the better accomplishment of which occupation the lady carried her head in her lap. Altogether, Owl's Abbey and its precincts supplied ample material for making the foolish villagers afraid of their own shadows. I was about 15 when the events which I shall now relate took place. One fine evening in summertime, as I was returning from a day's fishing in the mill stream about a mile from the village, I saw a lot of men talking earnestly to old Lap the cobbler, who was seated outside his little cottage working in the cool of the day. I knew most of the men by sight, for the village was not a very extensive place. There was Joe Barrett the blacksmith, his forge fire was out for that evening, old Abel Tandy, who was supposed to be the oldest inhabitant and lived very well on the strength of being too decrepit to work, Dick Millet, assistant at the flour factory, Jim Lantern, the town crier, and others. But amongst them was a man whom I had never seen before, and who was evidently a traveller only passing through the village. He had, it seems, from the conversation which I overheard, been inquiring into the village news and the village lions, amongst which, you may be sure, Barney's Ghost and the White Lady had been trotted out with great effect. The stranger had a smile on his face, while old Lap was holding forth. "Never you mind, mister. I see it, that's enough." "Ah," said the newcomer. "What was it that you say you saw?" "Say I saw," reported old Lap. "I did see it. There was Barney's Ghost a-hunting about in the ferns for the lockets and chains as was dropped thereabouts. Not of this world, I know, and I knew it at once for Barney's spirit." "Ah," chorused the bystanders, "you're right, old Lap." "When was the said Barney murdered, then?" inquired the stranger. "Ask Abel Tandy," said Barrett in a solemn voice. All eyes turned to the aged man, who with considerable pride at such a recollection replied shrilly, 80 year ago, come Michaelmas, 80 year ago. I were a boy then and had seen Barney ever so many times. Aye, it's all that time. 80 year." "Why then," said the traveller, turning to old Lap, "you can't be more than 58 or so, and couldn't have seen Barney alive. How did you manage to recognise him?" "Hadn't I been told that his spirit haunted the abbey, and was to be seen groping about for his jewellery? And when I see the figure a doing so, wasn't I right in supposing it were Barney's Ghost?" "Ah, sure," repeated the chorus, delighted to see the champion of the ghost in the ascendant. "And you mean to tell me that this abbey is haunted?" "Surely," shouted the chorus in perfect time. "And you firmly believe it?" "Ah, surely, why not? We've all seen it." "And you wouldn't pass through the ruins by night?" "Not for all the world," was the unanimous shout. "Ah, well," sneered the stranger, "I'm sorry for you. It's my nearest cut, I'm told, and through the abbey I go, Barney and the White Lady notwithstanding. Goodbye, and more sense to you." So saying, the traveller shouldered his way out of the gaping bystanders, and briefly asking if he was right in his direction, passed on whistling. Abel and old Lap were speechless at their own particular ghost being so pooh-poohed by a stranger, and all the gossips shook their foolish heads and hoped that nothing more would come of it. I went home much amused, but still thinking of the stranger's face, which seemed to haunt me. It was not a good face, but sly, cunning, and I thought cruel. When I rose next morning, I found on passing the village on my way to the little settlement which lay on the other side of Owl's Abbey, another gathering of the worthies of the night before, their faces graver than ever. They had a strange story to tell to everyone who would listen to them. The bank had been robbed, and more than that, several of the villagers' houses, including the sagacious old Lap's, had been entered, and whatever was of the least value stolen. There was enough here, you will say, to satisfy the most gossiping of our village, but superior to this excitement was the feeling of triumph at the signal defeat of the traveller of the night before, who it appears had returned to the village about 2 hours after he left the discussion I have recorded, trembling with fear, white as a sheet, and with teeth chattering. Twaddleton, our village, was avenged. Its legends had been verified, and the foolhardy stranger had been rewarded for his sneers by being frightened almost out of his wits at the sight of the White Lady and Barney's Ghost. This victory almost eclipsed the excitement of the robberies, but soon the reality of their losses wakened the silly gossips to a due sense of precaution. The stranger left the village by daylight, and no more was heard of him. Next night, Dick Millet's grey mare disappeared from her paddock. Soon after, Joe Barrett's tools were missing from the forge, and positively Jim Lantern's brass bell was carried off. Twaddleton was aghast. Watch was set, but in unguarded places the thief or thieves showed that they laughed Twaddleton to scorn, and every night some new robbery was to be bewailed. Things had gone on thus for a week, when a magistrate determined to send for a Bow Street runner, a detective we should call him now, from London. On the day that the man was sent for, my father permitted me to spend an evening with an uncle of mine, who lived at the neighbouring hamlet beyond Owl's Abbey. I was delighted at the holiday, and when I prepared to return, I found that evening had overtaken me, and as I promised to be at home by a certain hour, there was nothing for it but to borrow a lantern from my uncle and take the short cut through the wood, and worse still, through Owl's Abbey. On being laughingly asked if I were afraid, of course I was bound to say, not a bit, and with many good nights and a bull's-eye lantern, I set off for Twaddleton. I was not superstitious, and I didn't for an instant believe in the apparitions of Barney or the White Lady, but I am willing to confess to my feeling a sense of loneliness and helplessness when I found myself in the dark wood, with nothing to show the pathway but the little tunnel of light thrown by my lantern, which naturally made surrounding objects blacker still. Sometimes a hare would dart across the narrow footway, and sometimes an owl would flit before my face like a cloud of feathers and startle me as I ran. But now I approached Owl's Abbey, and my journey became interesting. As I got inside the territory of the ruins, I stumbled over a broken stone and my light was extinguished. Fortunately, the wood was past, and there was quite enough light left for me to pick my way in safety homewards. On I went, stepping from stone to stone and listening to the hooting of owls. Suddenly I heard a laugh, distinctly a laugh, and close by me. I own that I was greatly startled, but I stood still and listened again. The laugh was repeated, but this time I heard voices, apparently underground. I was not a little dismayed now, and all the village stories rushed across my brain, and I thought of Barney and the old abbot. Fear was, I confess it, getting the better of me, when I heard the neigh of a horse. Somehow this touch of mortality, for I had never heard of the ghost of a horse in the abbey, reassured me, and I listened with greater intentness. The sound of hooves trampling and some loud voices in correction now followed, and guided by them, I found that they proceeded from the old cellars in the refectory of the abbey. Kneeling down cautiously, I peeped through 2 worn-out pillars and saw... What? The stranger traveller, another man whom I had never seen before, and Millet's grey mare. There sat the men squabbling over certain property, pilfered no doubt from our villagers, and there, tethered up to a stone, was the unhappy old nag, who missed her warm quarters and regular feeds greatly. In a moment I was decided. Stepping cautiously away, I posted out of Owl's Abbey, perfectly free from alarm now, full of joy at having found out the robbers, and determined to lose no time in setting justice on their track. On I ran, and reaching the White Lady's bridge, there, sure enough, was a white figure sitting on the keystone of the arch. Mindful of my late experience, I went unflinchingly on. A cheery voice bade me, "Good night." It was a countryman in a smock frock resting on the bridge, evidently a stranger, or he would have respected the local tradition more. I told him what I had seen, and he kindly returned with me. On reaching Twaddleton, I told my story, and to my delight, a quiet man who had listened carefully to my narrative turned out to be the Bow Street runner. A cavalcade now formed. Barrett and Millet and Jim Lantern and many more, shamed out of their compunctions by my experience, joined the troop, and without losing time, we returned to Owl's Abbey. Here, cautiously dividing our forces, the detective made me lead the way to the spot where I had heard the voices. As we approached, a neigh was heard. "My old mare for ninepence!" roared Millet in ecstasy. In a moment there was a rush, a struggle, and the two rogues, regular London thieves, were collared and handcuffed. Having paved the way to plunder by trading on the foolish superstitions of the villagers, the principal robber had feigned alarm to disarm suspicion, and used to return nightly to thieve, knowing that while he and his accomplice and his plunder lay in Owl's Abbey, they were safe enough. The villains were punished in due course, and Twaddleton, having seen for itself that the reputed ghosts were all a myth, returned to its senses and used the short cut ever afterwards. And this is how the Twaddleton ghost was laid.